Started then. Welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. Thank you so much for being here today, Bruce.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. This is my turn, I'm guessing. Okay. Well, hello everyone. I know a few of you on the Zoom meeting, and like you all, I find the Zoom meeting to be kind of stiff and not as good as face to face. But those are the times, and I hope everybody is safe and well and taking care of themselves and their families too. I thought today, I know in your homework, as far as the cohort goes, we wanted you all to look at collections other than NMAI, other than other Smithsonian's, basically the anthropology section of the Natural History Smithsonian, and look for collections that have been from your community, as well as who's written about your communities, who are the ethnographers, where are those papers, what are those books, and so forth. And I'll come around to some of that. I know it's a difficult legacy from anthropology and museums, and it's been very hurtful and harmful to communities, and I'm not underplaying any of that. But today I'm gonna look at the bright side of people having collected from you all, and what can come of that. How can you find useful information within all the other things in anthropology's literature and collections and so forth. And I think there's a number of projects going on, certainly not just what I've been involved with, but I know there's lots of really good things going on. So I want to encourage you all to look at that. I also want to encourage everyone to think about the choices that your own community made, your grandparents or great-grandparents in allowing people to collect from your community, and what the sorts of things that people were thinking about. I couldn't decide on the title, so I think another title for this might be Making Anthropology Useful and Relevant, the idea of being hands-on and just being in charge, like these two guys are clearly in charge, which I think is just the way it should be when they walk into these types of places. Now, the discussion points today, oh, and one other thing about today, I'm gonna leave some time at the end so we can have a little more chat time rather than me just talking at you. So there will be some time at the end. I'm also very available to everyone as far as if you can't find something museum-wise or looking for the ethnographies of your communities and so forth, discussing what they mean. I'm very much available, and we can talk about my being available. So these are the discussion points for today. When planning a tribal museum, a cultural center, it's helpful to know where your community's objects, paper, and photographs were collected, how and why they were collected, and where they're housed today. Identifying those culturally specific collections are held, and exploring legacy. And what I mean by the legacy is looking at who collected them, what year is the collection done, but also some of the circumstances of your community. There are things that are certainly not pleasant about this, and I don't mean to gloss over them, but there were choices made by your community members, and I think there's some sometimes difficult choices. I think there's other types of choices made, and in my experience, people have talked to me about, well, they felt there was nobody to inherit a certain activity, and so they felt that selling it was the safest thing. They thought it was more dangerous to put it into somebody's hands who didn't truly understand how to use those particular types of objects. And now the other thing now is returning Native context and reuniting Native intellect to materials. This is the most important thing, that these collections sitting in these various repositories around the country and in Europe as well are missing these contexts, they're missing your voices, and reuniting that intellect with materials is going to enliven it, resuscitate it, revive it, put it back into use for you, however you'd like to put that. And learning about the loan and collection policies of institutions and building collaborative partnerships. So we're not talking about repatriation today. I think I want to be very clear about that. But this is about loan, that you're dealing government to government just as anybody else who walks into these museums. There's no reason museums can't loan to you as another entity. They loan all the time. So they're built to loan. They're built to take care of these collections. They're built to have people use the collections. And I think it's really about just building sort of collaborative partnerships with these places to begin to facilitate that. And again, we're gonna talk about objects and papers and photographs, not covered under laws such as NAGPRA. Now, NAGPRA is a very, very important law, but if you have 1,000 pieces in a museum collection, NAGPRA might cover 2 or 3 or 10, let's say, of those objects. But what about those other 990 objects? How about that? Something we call maybe cultural patrimony. And those are the things we're going to focus on. And those are the types of collections that some of the work I'm going to describe has been focused on. And I really want to talk about this space between the objects on the museum shelves. And what I mean that's where the values and principles of the communities reside, and only what communities can resuscitate and restore. The museum, those are empty spots in the museum, as metaphorically talked about the spaces, and I think that's really important. And again, a sort of certain guidepost for us today. It's easy and it's justifiable for just Native communities to be upset with museums. I've downplayed, just called it upset, but it's really just pissed off, mad, hurt, so forth. And there's a century-long legacy of removing and collecting from communities without any reciprocity, without any return. And it was reproachful and harmful and damaged, as I've said. Now, our task is to interrogate the circumstances of collecting and the resulting collections to locate what might be useful to the community. And we can't undo this legacy, but we can undo this past legacy. We can't really make things go away that way, but we can invest ourselves in bringing about positive needed change caused by this rapacious collecting. How do we put ourselves forward? So let's focus on the more, I think getting upset is certainly valuable, but I think it's more complicated to focus on changing and assisting these collecting institutions and understanding their legacy, and how positive change brings institutional change. I know that many of us talk about decolonization, and I really understand decolonization. I think that in my work, I've been involved with that in all the places where I am today and where I work in Washington and Santa Fe. But it's not about decolonization in the sense of Native communities need something new and different, not just to change something that's there. It needs total change. This isn't about surfing over the top. This is about getting inside and making changes from the inside out. I just want to point out too, cultures, you're on a Zoom meeting. We're not doing this some other means, but cultures are always on the move and accumulating new tools. Here's this Laguna woman carrying a pot with water on her head. She's got a steel bucket as well. And now I'm just going to go through some examples of things to think about with museums. So here's a drawer in New York City. It's collected in 1903. And as you can see, I think my cursor's on that, right? You can see my cursor, I hope. But you see these packages here. They have never been unwrapped since 1903. So they're with the original notes. They're with the original packaging. This is all pottery materials collected from San Ildefonso and Santo Domingo or Tewa Pueblo. And you can see the sort of value of that maybe somebody wants to see this compared to what they're doing, but only the community can really unwrap this. This is also another, this is how they see us, how you all as Native people, but this sort of handsome man staring back to the camera, this Kurdish shot is a classic way. And there's nothing wrong with this handsome guy. And there's a lot of information in that photograph clearly. But how about who people are today? And these two Zuni friends here are chatting up a storm. They look great in the blue gloves. And they're here in anthropology, Smithsonian anthropology, looking through collections and telling it like they see it, not how the dominant society wants them to be seen. I think another thing is to think about how any collection's arbitrary. And what I mean by that, when somebody comes into the community to collect, most often than not, it's what's available or what's happening at that particular time. And I think the question then becomes, how do we work together and make them useful and relevant? So if somebody comes in, there's a story in an interview with Maria Martinez from San Ildefonso, and her grandmother passed away, and they opened the storage room. This is about 1912, 1914. And they opened her storage room, and there were probably 20 large pots for storage and for water, for clothing, and so forth. And the family felt they wanted to not keep those. They gave one to each relative, but there were still about 10 of those pots. So that particular circumstance, this guy who collected these pots you're looking at on the shelf here came back to the Pueblo, and he purchased the pots. And Maria talks about how it took 4 wagon loads for that guy, Herbert Spinden, the curator at the museum, to take those pots to Santa Fe to ship back. So there is some voluntary sometimes not, but it is very arbitrary about what's there. You can see all the different things on these shelves. If you know a little bit about pottery, you can see over here, they've got all this San Ildefonso stuff all the way through here. And then over here, they have an Acoma vessel and something probably from Santa Clara. And also, one of the things that happens is museum collections look so different. So all these pieces were all collected by a guy named George Pepper in 1903. But you can see how different they look in different places. This is a picture up here. He took of them in about 1903, 1904. This is the American Museum of Natural History, and this is Penn State in College Station. But you can see they almost don't look like they're from the same place. Now, a community's knowledge can help dissipate the arbitrary nature and meanings of anthropology. And what I mean by that is that anthropology has a certain theoretical basis or methodological basis, and that's the way they looked at things. So, for example, anthropology was always interested and continues to be interested in older things, which is older means more authentic, that somehow people in the past are more authentic than people today. So people at 1900 were not as authentic as somebody at 1800. This is a foolish game to play about authenticity, because authenticity is always there. I will say that the community of Pewaukee is Carl Duncan, who's the head of the Poe Museum, a non-Pewaukee member, and then Kathy Fierro and Ruben Martinez. And they were pleased to see that all the things were stamped with Pewaukee up here. They thought that was great fun and easy for their community to identify things. And the other thing about the thing, so you go to NMAI, for example, this is an NMAI preparing for this long-term loan that's now in place. And it's really a benefit for the community, because things preserved in one place can help with continuance and perseverance in another place. So you look at the positive outcome of collecting, that it can prove quite good. And both these people, in particular, the guy in the darker shirt, Eric Fender, have now used this. He's a potter, and he has his knowledge of historical pottery, which was already big, has grown exponentially. There's also this sort of circumstance that there might be the only photograph of somebody. This is a very famous person, Pablito Velarde. She was a very famous individual from Santa Clara Pueblo. This is the only portrait of her parents, period. And then this guy too, this Jose Santos Naranjo, the circumstances of taking the photograph. You can see the photographer's shadow in this great Victorian dress on the wall right near him. But these photographs are in England, yet they're about the community. I facilitated a young woman who was studying at Oxford to bring some of these photographs back to the community. I think it was a great circumstance overall. There's also one of the things about looking at original notes. So this is George Pepper's notes when he visited San Ildefonso in 1903, June 24th in 1923. And so, as I said, that anthropologists have a sort of theoretical methodology. They're looking for older things and so forth. And a lot of times notes don't have those methodologies. They're not organized in a way, but they're what people are seeing on the ground. So they can be a lot more loose, and they're not reorganized into a finished writing or with theoretical concepts and concerns. So that can be really good for the community to look at. By practice, a lot of the anthropological literature and museums catalogs do not include people's names. And this is the place to find people's names in these original records and in these original catalog information. It's also people are very interested in their own history. This is a copy of a ethnography of San Ildefonso by William Whitman. And these notes, you can see my pencil notes around the outside. These are the annotations working with community members about who's who, what's being said there, clarifying what this guy Whitman is talking about. And his letter here, this is one of many letters that he wrote back. So his letters are in Ruth Benedict's papers at Vassar. So the book is published. It's published by Columbia University. He was in the community in the late 40s, post-war, and his advisor was Ruth Benedict. And Benedict's papers are in Vassar, of all places, in terms of it's not usually the place where you look for these types of things. But you can see that he's pretty honest. He says, I'm right here, ethnologists are not in good repute, either among the Indians or the whites who wish to shelter them. And he says he's moving slowly and so forth. I just think the letter says an awful lot. There's also this, oh, look how fuzzy that photo is. There's also this sort of stuff in collections. And these are pseudo-ceremonial. These are made to keep people out of Zuni's kivas. And they're made with some humor and taking community members through the collections. These are at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture here in Santa Fe. And they are definitely meant to be humorous. They're also meant to fool the collectors, white people, and to keep people back. This is another collection. This is a collection by that man, Herbert Spinden. They're in New York, and it's filled with these pots. And he's obviously, he's telling some stories, but he also needs a few dollars from the collectors. So he made up this sort of type of pottery to help him financially. So that's kind of how that lays out, just to think about museums and to think about the types of possibilities that are there. I think it's a big landscape, and I think that working with people, finding those things, I think it can be quite useful. There are, again, I don't want to underplay the hurt of collecting to communities, but I think that putting that in its place and moving forward, I think is incredibly important. I want to talk then about a few other examples of the way that communities have worked with museums. And I want to start with Ashui Awan Museum and Heritage Center, which is at the Pueblo of Zuni, and Jim Enote, who I'm sure is known to most of you, if not all of you. And so it's a project started with another person actually at Zuni, head of tourism, and Jim took over it about halfway through. I was at NMAI at the time. I was head of research and collections, and there was an NEH grant written by the tourism department with some outside archaeologists, and they now had money to create an exhibition. So the first flow of people came through, and we were in the process of moving the collections from New York to Washington to the Cultural Resources Center. And the New York facility was a ragged warehouse, to put it best. And we naturally offered for people to go up to New York and to go through the collections. Things were very hard to see, but I did suggest that if they did that, we would prioritize the moving of the Zuni collections to Washington, and then they should come back and see the collections again. So they went to New York, and they selected about 100 objects or so for this exhibition they wanted to do at the Heritage Center. And then in the meantime, Jim came in and replaced Tom Kennedy. And Jim then came back with a group of people, and they came to Washington. And I think the final number of objects that went to Zuni for this extended loan was 232 pieces. And I will say that it was not without resistance amongst the collection staff that I oversaw for lots of museum reasons. And I don't think those were the proper reasons. We talked them out, and we signed a 3-year agreement with Zuni for the loan. This was in 2001. And it was, I think Jim and I winked at each other. I don't expect neither of us expected things to return in those 3 years. And here it is 19 years later, and those collections are still there. One more thing I just want to say about the return. It was all materials from an excavation, a large excavation of one of their ancestral villages, a very important village. And they titled the exhibition in a way, and every archaeologist near and far came to the opening figuring that Zuni was going to tell the real history of this ancestral place. And what they used the collections for instead was to tell the history of intruders into their village, which I thought was great. And then Jim began to think about the collections being there. And one of the things he did was he did these maps. He talked about maps and landscapes. And you can see he's talking about it here. Maps are in songs, they're in prayers. People recount where they've been and where they're going through the songs they have. There's maps in stones and they're painted on ceramics. There's lots of ways that the Zuni community, and I'm sure your communities have other ways that you have maps of your who you are culturally, both tangibly and intangibly, who you are. And he wanted the maps, he wanted these landscapes returned to Zuni people. And so he had these paintings done of the Zuni landscape and where things were important points of their narrative took place. And he says here for this particular painting, and he had Zuni people do the paintings, and this is what hangs in the museum, in the front of the museum. He said the names around here are in English and Spanish, so they completely leave off the meaning of the place, meaning that the Spanish word, like the mountains in Albuquerque, are called the Sandias, the watermelon mountains. But the Tewa people call that Okupi, which is Turtle Mountain. Very different way of looking at that same place, and doesn't have the associations that Okupi have. The Sandia has to do with the color of the mountains at sunset, and they can be beautiful. But he said that he was replacing our language and eclipsing our language, and knowledge was something different. And so just trying to get that back was really what Jim did. So he took the idea of this loan, they expanded the loan, they took the loan and told a story they wanted to tell with the loan, and the loan is still there, and they're continuing to do these types of things and expand on Zuni's own knowledge of the world. Zuni people have gone around in many places and done great things. They've been a real leader in this. I just want to indicate that. And these two guys here, over here, Anibal Rodriguez and Adam Watson, if you had the opportunity to work with them at the American Museum of Natural History, you know how open they were. And you also know how difficult these cabinets could be. There's also this idea that you have all types of experts together talking about things. This is a basket exhibit that we did at NMAI, and looking for ways to make the basket exhibit easier. I asked people we're working with, what should I do? And they said, why don't you go ahead and select some things? And I put out about 500 baskets from the collections in one of those collection rooms. And they came in, Terrell and Lisa, and they said, oh, this is not going to work. And they reselected. I loved it. They left about 20 pieces that I had selected and just reselected a bunch of pieces. We ended up with about 200 pieces in the exhibit. So that, that can help. This is also, I think, the way things should look. On the right are Acoma women at the School for Advanced Research. And they're looking at collections. You can see they're in charge of the collections. They're doing things. And this is Governor Brian Vio, who's working with us on a project at the Young Museum in San Francisco. They received a collection of about 200 pieces from the Tom Weissel collection, all collected in the Native Art Marketplace, largely without any documentation. So how do you return those things to the community? And that's what we focused on in this project. We have a catalog we're doing of the 200 or so objects. Right now we have about 60 authors for the catalog. So how do you show the diversity and multivocality? These are some of the ways that you can do those things. There's another project that we recently completed working with the community of San Ildefonso. And how do you take a collection, it's a very large portion of the collection at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, and how do you take that collection and return it to people and give them voice about returning? There are many things we learned along the way. And so one of the things they said, well, when we open the exhibit, we want to feed everybody who comes. So these 25 women from the community came, and they fed about 900 people that day. It was really terrific, really, really terrific. And Eric Fender over here is one of the co-curators. Russell way in the back here is one of the co-curators, and I guess that's me on the other side. Um, but the community really stepped up to some great video we're working right now to get online. And this is how things should look. I really like this photo because here's Eva and Elvis and somebody else is taking their photographs because people, this belongs to them. They don't feel like this is just another exhibit, but this belongs to them. These are Eva's grandparents who all through the exhibition and really, really putting that into that way. And like I said, I think there's some really good um, things going on in museums. I think museums are working really hard. And I think this thing called collection stewardship, museums used to say, our collections, we own these collections, we're taking care of these collections. But this idea of stewardship, this mutuality, and taking direction from Native people is really changing things. And I would hope that every one of you have been involved in a project like this or not like that. It is still complicated. People still need to come to a facility like the Indian Arts Research Center in Santa Fe. You can see she's struggling with a high shelf here. But I think things are really, and these types of ideas are going absolutely in the right direction. This is another place, this is a lot of information, but I really want to urge you to go to guidelines for collaboration.info, guidelines for collaboration.info. And these collections guidelines, there's a set for communities and there's a set for museums. And I think they have a lot of really valuable things to say about how communities might work best with museums and what museums might have to offer with them. And then also how museums might work with communities. This is a long 4-year project they've been working on, and the words are very, very careful. So I would urge you again to look for guidelines for collaboration.info. You may have heard the group talk about it in one of the past ATOM meetings. It's really quite a good document and good reference. This is another reference document. I worked with Ed Ladd. It was my privilege and honor to work with Ed Ladd from Zuni. And he always said, I would say, well, what are we going to do about this exhibit or that? He goes, I don't know, we're the museum, was always what his response to everything was. And I do think it's more than just being funny, as Ed would be funny. I think there's a real deep meaning to that thing that Ed would always say. So I want to get to this Tewa, Poeh. They came back, the coming home of 100 Tewa pots, and talk about how the project was conceived, what its outcomes have been. It's really been quite great. And that's what I'm going to spend the last part of my chat on. So we had 3 types of projects. When the governor asked me to come up and work with the community of Pewaukee, the Pueblo of Pewaukee, I've been working with them since 2012 formally. I was asked to do 2 different things. One was to become the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and help with history and culture projects as well, acknowledging my network of working in museums, and also to start a foundation, which is a whole other story we're not going to talk about today. But so we set out 3 things that we would look at, these sort of cultural history projects for the community. We were going to investigate ancestral other cultural sites, and includes bringing cultural experts to reconfigure relationships. And those cultural experts, so-called cultural experts, are archaeologists. And we're having a lot of play inside the archaeological community in terms of making archaeologists think about working on behalf of Native communities instead of telling Native communities who they think they are. And we want to reunite traditional knowledge in museum collections. So I'll show you what that looks like. And then this planning and building a study center at the Poeh Center to house a returned Smithsonian collections, to also serve as inspiration for language and culture instruction. So those are the 3 projects as we laid out these years where I've worked with them. And I thought of this, I figured we did this project a long time ago. This is like 28 years ago. But then Lieutenant Governor George Rivera, George said that we really want to start this Poeh Center. We want to build a museum, but we need to do a few things. And can you loan us some objects? I was then at the Museum of Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And I said, well, of course we can loan you some stuff. Do you have a place? And he had this tumble down building, quite honestly, that's now torn down completely. And we walked around in it, and George turned to me. It had no heating or cooling, no security. It was standing alone. It was total standalone. And George said, "We're going to put some security, and we're going to put bars on the window." And we did put an exhibit in there, and I think it was an important step. And I think both on the Poeh side and museum side, we all held our breath a little bit. But we have to ask ourselves, when you're thinking about these projects that you're doing, is it a cultural center or museum? And, there's no walls around Tewa or Indian country. You don't see any buildings on the landscape here. This is all Tewa world, all these places. So how is the community brought inside and shared with community members and visitors? How are you going to do that? Thinking about what that means. And how does the community recognize itself? In other words, in the exhibitions and programs and projects, will the community recognize itself? If community members go to a museum and look at collections, sometimes things that are supposed to be from the community aren't initially recognized for certain reasons. But to think about how you recognize, and think about when people, like that San Ildefonso example, that when people walked into that exhibit, we worked very hard. The community would think it's their exhibit, and that we would recede into the background. So the community recognized itself. And the other thing is, museum can be with a heavily negatively connotative word, and so not to think automatically museum. And Poeh, like every other place, has a problem of black and white and color, and then and now. And so these two upper photographs, a young woman who is unidentified name-wise, and then this picture by 1903, that's George Pepper's wife standing with the parasol. Down here, we've got, Mateo Romero and Adam Duran, Adam's father, and Governor Talachi's in this shot. So we've got a lot of people. If you're paying attention, here's David right here. David was in the Smithsonian looking at those collections earlier. And here's a picture of the governor being honored on January 6th. So it's such a difference of knowing names, not knowing names. We can stand at the place where she's standing with her parasol. Those buildings aren't there anymore, but we can stand there, and we've been working very hard on that place. Now, again, I've done this, I've said a little bit about this, but changing the tone of the conversation. So these are a few guideposts for changing this tone of the conversation that I think is something to really work on, and I think it's going to change the museum world. Museum world per se on their own is not going to change. They need Native people. So museums and anthropologists collected objects and not the culture and values of communities. I pointed this out by the metaphor of the space between the objects on the shelves. And I mean this, that they might have something of your community, but they don't have your culture, they don't have your values. You still have those, and you are responsible for uniting those. The museum really can't do that. It's not their position. And again, we can't change what's been done, but we can correct how we move forward, make positive and lasting change. Museums and cultural institutions are making important changes. I think they're really trying. I think that some trying harder than others, okay. And they need and want partners to show them the way. And I think this is a critical part of this, building friendships and partnerships. They may not know how much they need a partner, or they may know how much they need a partner, but there's all ways to do that. And show them the way. Make your community their foremost, first and foremost partner. Just like Jim Eno did with NMAI when I was there. We were it. Jim's focus was dead set on us, and it really helped us in the museum to continue to form the collections policies. I think even leading to what is going on with Cynthia Chavez Lamar, and Bessie Tessa's on the line, and the great programs they're doing with loaning, and then being involved in the cohort. And I think making sure that these projects and the museum are respectful, responsible, and useful. I think these watchwords are incredibly important. And I think in you're bringing home the collections, there's new forms and thinking about restoring relevance and usefulness, that not everything's in a little box, not everything's classified by a number. This is an accession book from the Smithsonian, and this is how things were picked up. People picked up only the stones around the community because they didn't want to talk to anybody that felt that they were not authentic enough in the language of the day. And then learning to read museum information. So this is a piece collected from Poeh. This is a piece, a little teapot made out of micaceous clay. Tierra Maria that's what this represents here. Poeh, obviously, New Mexico. You can see all this confusion here between John Wesley Powell and Stevenson. Powell was the head of this Bureau of American Ethnology, the BAE, that thing there. And Stevenson was the person who was in New Mexico collecting. That's why there's difference there. Here's the publication, how it's illustrated in that publication. You have also, this object now has this catalog number on it, but there's also information with succession. In other words, 100 things come in, they're all given one accession number. They're given one number to help track it. And then there's this number here, 275, the original number. That means that Stevenson, when he's collecting, puts a number on the piece to track it as it's going back to Washington. And this is all the museum talking to itself about illustrations, whether it makes sense or not. And every card is coded with information. And I think as you begin to see that, so from this card, we might want to look up Stevenson to see what type of publications there are. And there are some publications by Stevenson. This is James Stevenson, and then his wife, he passes away in 1882 or so, and his wife, Matilda Cox Stevenson, who's much more famous, steps in, begins to collect as well. And she has a negative legacy to say, but I will say her collections notes are much more broad-minded than the way she collected and the way she wrote her finished publications. So you might not want to read her finished publications because they just make you angry, including me. But they certainly, her notes are much more about people and who she's working with, and show a fondness for people, actually, in some ways. And again, this idea of being assertive about where you are. So this idea of Tewa country, and we're working in Tewa country that is not new, it's not different, it's an acknowledgement. We're crisscrossing their lands all the time. The borders are present day villages, reservation borders, really are meaningless because we're really within the boundaries of their homeland. And they've always been here, they'll always be here, and their becoming is really incredibly important. So we begin to see then that this idea of a space between the objects, and that's where culture resides. And culture doesn't reside in the museum and whereverville, US, but it's really here on the land. And that land is unchanging. And that's why it's Tewa country, because these vistas, these mountain vistas that you see, the east and west doors to the Tewa world, these have been here since time immemorial, and the calling of ancestors for rain and so forth. Those are unchanging things. I'm checking the time. I guess I should speed up. I'm going to skip that. One of the projects investigating land-based things, ancestral sites, is going out with knowledgeable cultural leadership and discussing the project and having their approval, and then demonstrating. These are two Tewa guys, Louis and Patrick, here discussing and looking for these little types of things like this. This is the edge of an agricultural field. You can see the whole hillsides falling down, but the agricultural field, which was built about 1400, is still doing its work. It's also about involving kids. We did drone photography, so he's guiding the drone photography here. And then these two guys here, the guy on the left, Isaiah, is from the community, working with an undergraduate, developing the tracking. And I think a lot about this is about listening again and again, and seeing, and just sitting back and understanding those things. And maybe this is more for an outsider like myself, but I think for all of us as Native people, non-Native people, that really beginning to understand circumstances. And then using these spaces, this is a Tewa language class at a site, and expanding potentials and helps expand knowledge, looking for all the ways that these places can be used. I want to go back to George Pepper for a second. And so Pepper collected from Pewaukee. And I saw this photograph. I began looking for these things. I found those notes. I found the pottery. This one's a community member living in College Station, Penn State right now, just one Pewaukee pot among others. So here is his notes from those days. And you can see these are the pots in the photograph like this, right? It makes some arrows. And I found 10 of the 11 pots, and they're located in New York, New York City, Berkeley, and College Station. And the notes, like this notes here, that's located in Tulane, and the photograph is also originally in Tulane. So how does that sort of thing happen? I showed this to actually Jason Garcia and showed him how we located those pots. And so this pot here in New York City, and Jason really liked that idea. And his reaction to it, excuse my language, but Jason's reaction is "fuck yeah," which I love as a comment on the project and its helpfulness to the community. And one of our next steps is going to bring these pots home and put them in front of the photograph, of course. Now the Tewa Poeh project is a long project. We started in 2012 and approached because of my relationship with the museum in Washington. We approached the director, Kevin Gover, and we talked about this idea of bringing pots back. People always ask me why 100. It was a round number. And I worked on that with then Governor George Rivera and his lieutenant, Joe Talachi. Joe is now the governor, and I will say Joe is the inspiration for all of these projects. This is a common scene. You go to these places, you can see Ruben and everybody else walking down these aisles. This is anthropology and all the closed cases. And I think that the closed cases, one of the reasons everything's in the open at NMAI are these types of places, as all cabinets, where there's things that could potentially be hidden from people. We didn't want that at NMAI. We wanted everything out in the open. People were allowed to go through every drawer and see everything. You can see staff hanging back. You can see back here. This is Cynthia back here, over here. But you can see she's back from everybody. That people, the community members are looking through things. So Kathy Fierro and Ruben Martinez and Linda Romero. This is again Carl Duncan, who's the executive director for the Poeh Center. He's not a community member, but a Native person, and has really helped the Poeh Center, done so many great things. And again, looking at these drawers of things that people picked up from around the village without asking people's permission. People let them on the lifts. That's one of the great pleasures of NMAI, is getting on those lifts and going up and down. And let's just talk a little bit about the Poeh Center. So one of the things about the condition of the loan, we worked then with Kevin, and then when Cynthia came on in 2014, I think, we began to work with Cynthia in particular and talked about the precedent of the Zuni loan. And Cynthia and the museum both agreed that a small section of the 100 pieces might be wise. So 9 pieces were loaned and created this exhibit here. And then the thing about the pottery, once it arrived at Milwaukee by truck, was at Tewa hands only, returned to Tewa hands. And Tessie Naranjo, one of the great intellectual leaders in the Tewa community, said it's like a heartbeat, that the heartbeat is faint. But as they returned cross country to their origin place, to their communities, to their families, that heartbeat grew stronger. And by putting Tewa hands on the pieces, that heartbeat is resuscitated. This is Tessie here in the black and white check there. And in between then that loan of 9 pieces and the loan of the other 91 pieces, there were a series of things that happened, a series of types of visits, checking with conservation, talking about the meanings of the pottery, those types of things. Cynthia sent people to Milwaukee to work with registration, collections management types of tools, photographies. And this is the mount making workshop. Here's Linda and Carl working on the mount making workshop. So there were a lot of back and forth, a lot of great help from NMAI for the community. And this is the 91 pots arriving. Again, all Tewa hands and everybody else standing back. And it was a really terrific circumstance. And again, Ruben, who's been at the center of this project for 9 years, he's just right there with everything again. And here's the leadership. They're waiting for me to leave the room, by the way, if you really want to know the truth. So it got all quiet. And I work very closely with the community. They're very kind to me and everything. And they're now going to bless the return of the pottery. And so everybody's kind of looking at each other. And finally, Adam here, the war chief, who I work with all the time, Adam said, Bruce. And so, still an outsider, and I think that's an important place. So then this is the sort of thing. This is how the exhibit now looks. That's up. It's up. It's a 3-year loan. Hopefully there'll be renewals of that loan. There were many requirements that needed to be done to the room. The Cargill funds in particular have been very generous to the Pueblo to help facilitate much of this. The Pueblo has come up with a great deal of funds as well. And that's kind of what the project looks like, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And look, I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to stop sharing. And then I know that we were talking about all of you having kind of a homework assignment of what those places. Melissa, is that you covered up with that?
Yes, so on the email that I sent out,
Hey.
yeah, on the email that I sent out, did anyone find any of their collections in other places outside of Smithsonian institutions that they would like to share?
We have. Chickland has. There is a substantial amount of information and knowledge in the Federica de Laguna collections. Federica de Laguna was an anthropologist, and I'm sure some of you already know that. She did extensive research for many years on the Pacific Northwest in Alaska. So her collection has been divided up into 2 locations: the National Anthropological Archives, which is Smithsonian owned, but also the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And we've actually have been working with Brian Carpenter there to get audio recordings. We actually have photographs of people that she interviewed. So we're trying to create more context and connection with the photographs that we have through the voices of those elders. So that's one place that we know of.
Terrific. And you bring up Brian, who's been a great facilitator of getting things back to communities. So that's wonderful. And what type of reputation does De Laguna have in the community?
She worked primarily north of us in her documentation. So she's not really spoken of, but she was during her time very well received. In fact, she even was given an Atna name. So I think she was very considerate of the people she worked with, and so much so that some of her materials at NAA are restricted. You have to go through a very long process to try to get access to them out of respect for the privacy of the people she interviewed. So I think she did a very good job of working with the Indigenous communities here. I think the problem is the repositories that have her materials do not have as great of a history of working with tribes until recent years. So like I mentioned, Brian at APS has been amazing, super easy to work with, very interested in working with us. I would say NAA has been a difficult process. It's something we're still working with. And I think a lot of it is, as you mentioned before in your presentation, a lack of understanding. We visited there just actually this year, earlier in February before COVID happened. And a lot of it was just, they just didn't know. They didn't know anything about the Atna people. I mean, they barely knew anything about Alaska. So I think for us, it's mostly an educational opportunity for the tribe.
I think that's a great point of how it's an educational opportunity for you as a community going. And I think NAA is trying, but it does lag behind in some ways. It's just, and I can give you the name of a curator that maybe could help you a little bit, just in terms of talking to them. They had a person on a 3-year postdoc fellowship that she's leaving now. and she was a great open person there. It's tough going there. Plus, they have so many thousands of feet of papers, and they have. I'm not justifying them, but you're working with people who are archivists first, not cultural experts.
I absolutely agree with you there. It's definitely
Yeah. So
something we
yeah.
noticed when we were visiting. They were
Yeah.
extremely kind and helpful while we were there, but they had a lot. They didn't have a lot of knowledge in regards to Atna culture, and then it seemed like they were very disorganized there. I mean, it's very crazy to say that in a federal archive, but in regards to who knows what, in regards to access and attaining copies, it was very disjointed, which made our experience not pleasant. But that's something we're hoping to work on with them.
Again, not in defense of them, I promise, but they're terrifically underfunded and understaffed, and critique Smithsonian anthropology. There's a lot of money in the curators who write for publication for other anthropologists, but the collections and archives don't tend to have that larger level of support. It depends more on who the leadership in that area of the museum is at that
Yeah, I definitely got
time. That's strange people.
I definitely got that as well. We were asking about digitization, and they had mentioned how they had this amazing digitization equipment, but they didn't have anybody actually trained on staff other than one person to use it.
Wow.
So it's why they've been very, very slow in digitizing the collections that they have in their care.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And there are and there are grants from your side of the equation. There are grants to digitize and do different things, and you should be looking to some of those grants.
And I would really
Thank you.
appreciate
Thank
the
you for
contact
sharing.
you mentioned.
Okay. Thank you for sharing.
I would like to share. Hi, Bruce.
Hi,
It's
Melissa. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah,
How are
I
you?
see you. Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I used to hang out at the co-collection when I was a student with Bruce. Yeah, so I'm from Chickaloon, so the community that Selena is talking about. And I've done a lot of work as an artist working with collections, and I've always found it really hard to work with federal collections unless it was like a specific program. So I've been working with more private, smaller collections that I'd like to share about. The Valdez Museum is a small museum. It's a small city museum, but they have a lot of Atna objects and sheep horn ladles. The Wells Fargo Museum is actually a really great resource, and I've been building a relationship with somebody who works there, and they actually allowed me to bring I think 4 Atna objects up the road to the village, like 4 hours north of their collection.
Oh, good.
And something about like private collections, there's a little bit more accessibility, because if you establish relationships with those private collectors, you can do a lot more education work with them, because they just aren't, they don't have the same, I won't say responsibilities, but the same sort of like barriers that a lot of like museum collections have. I'd also say that like the Anchorage Museum has a large collection there, which is actually owned by the city. So they have sort of at least a moral, imperative to let it be known to the community. Access is always kind of difficult because they don't have everything like NMAI. Not everything is open. Their records aren't open, and that's just a process that I think that they probably will work through in the years to come. And then I've always wanted to go to the Field Museum in Chicago, where Bill Simeon did a lot of work on Atna regalia in a lot of his publications that he's done. And then, of course, some of the village museums. There's one village museum up in Galkana in Taslina Copper Center, which house a lot of objects that are important and are looking to be cared for. They have a safe. And yeah, my aunties are also on the call. They might know of other ones, I'm not sure. But a lot of the objects were at least in the private collections and including the Anchorage Museum, were collected by a man. His name was Chris. I wrote it down. Oh, Charles Malkpine, who has like kind of a difficult history in Alaska. He ended up getting arrested for some of the things that he stole, but he actually populated most of the collections that are in local museums in Alaska. And yeah, so that was the homework I did.
That's great. And part of one of the great values of that is for the development of the Cultural Center Museum is to begin to make a list of where things are and to begin those contacts, you know, where you've been so far, private and public collections, and then where you want to go next and why you want to go there, compiling those publications like from the field in terms of their collecting there in the Fieldiana, as you know, and just beginning to look through those things and just getting those in a place where the community has access to them.
For sure. And I also just like to say too, when I was a student at II in Santa Fe, like Bruce opened up the Co-Center. Like I just came to hang out with the objects because I wanted to be around them. And I think that moments like that too, where you can just sort of open your door without any sort of like expectations and just trust people in those ways because it's the right thing to do, it was really, it started the work that I do now as a curator and artist. So, Janan.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I haven't looked too much into where our collections are, but I know that we have some local like county historical societies that have collections, and they're pretty good about working with us on kind of going through their collections, identifying, and then also like redoing their displays and things. And I wanted to ask you guys if you heard of the new STOP Act that was just put out. I don't know, they did like a legislative thing and I didn't have time to get comments in, but I wanted to see what your kind of knowledge of that was, or if you've heard anything about it.
No one else speaking up. So there's a third version has just been submitted over the last few months. I've forgotten when, and but it hasn't reached the floor yet.
Okay.
And given the COVID situation, I think it'll be slow reaching the floor of the House at this point. But it's been introduced, and there's support. There's support for it from Western states primarily, and particularly New Mexico. Not all of the Western state House representatives and senators are supportive of something like that. They see it as a negative on free commerce. Mm-hmm. Susan, you have something? You came up on the screen.
We're a supporter of that act, and we work closely with the people who have put it forward. They had a meeting, a congressional meeting on it last week. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but if you're interested, we can have one of the key people give a presentation on it. It primarily deals with stopping cultural objects leaving the country. Yeah. What does STOP stand for? I should look it up real fast.
Safeguard tribal.
But it's primarily.
Safeguard.
Can you repeat that?
Safeguard tribal objects of patrimony.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the major obstacles are primarily art dealers or antique dealers and people who think it will interfere with the commerce. But it's a good act, and we can share the text of it with you, and if you would like, let Melissa know, and we can arrange for the attorney to give you a presentation. And I'm sure that he would appreciate the support of all of you on it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
We haven't had too much, to my knowledge, experience in that with any of our cultural materials being exported, or I know that's an issue in France and stuff, but I was wondering how you start that process to identify, like, if your tribe has something that's up for auction, or I don't know too much about it. So
there's two different tracks. I'm sorry, I don't know where you're from, Stormy, so I don't.
I'm from Port Yamasquam, from Washington
Oh,
State.
okay. So there's two different things. There's two kind of things I might suggest. One is the Association for American Indian Affairs, and they put out, every time there's an auction, they put out a link to the auction, and then Shannon puts down what she thinks may or may not be sensitive, and it comes as an email. So it's instructive. You can sort of keep up with auctions that way. The other way I would suggest is through National Park Service and Historic Preservation Grant. And that cycle won't come up again, I don't think. There might be one at the end of the year, but look under tribal programs under historic preservation, and there are grants for tribes to go around to cultural institutions to look for their collections, specifically to look for culturally sensitive materials. So that might be another way. It's hard to say what's going to happen with the Mellon Foundation that was supporting some of this. They're going to reconfigure themselves. But I think there's probably other grant sources that I'm not mentioning here. But I think the act of traveling around and going to places, asserting yourself that you're very much alive and interested, does a lot of good for the communities as well as where you're visiting.
Thank you.
I just want to share something real quick because I have another meeting to go to. Just in regards to the De Laguna collections and other old museum collections, and some of the things that I learned working with one of our elders is that the old photos that they used to publish, and they used to always show our people and never identify who they were. And that was something that one of our elders like really expressed to us, that it really dehumanized us. And I think that's something that I think now going forward that we can improve on. When we post pictures of old photos and family and people, our own people, is that we make sure that we identify like who they are, and like their names, their like the place where they're at, kind of really trying to find those photos that you can identify with. And if you can't, don't just share it publicly, because it really it's something that my aunt Katie had expressed to me one time, and it always stuck with me. Like, that was so true. It just really felt like we weren't a people, when we see photos in books and not identify it, because she would say, these guys have a family, they have a life, they have, it's a real thing. It's not just nothing. And I just wanted to share that.
That's an incredibly important point. I think that is one of the legacies of anthropology, is dehumanizing people, and the idea that everyone's the same, everyone's an Indian, or everybody's same in the village, that people don't have individual families and personalities. It's one of the not good legacies. And I think by going back to the archives, sometimes you can find identifications, and then you can also, in the community itself, we've been able to identify photographs of people and put names on them, understand who they are. One night I was doing some stuff here at home, and I found something. It's like 11 or 12 at night. I text one of my co-curators, and I said, "Oh, look at this. I think this is your grandmother." He had never seen a picture of her, and he checked them with older cultural leadership, and they said, "Yeah, that's her." So, using what's available to us, and I think that's probably putting the humanity back into the collections is really what this is about. And my point about the museums needing community members and wanting community members, that humanizing of things is, I think, what most people in museums desire to have at this point. So that was a very good point, excellent point. Thank you for sharing that.
I think too, just on that same point, like moving forward, if we're taking photos or submitting photos to the archives, about having that identification of who and when and where is important for our future generations too, so that we can, we can do better now for them.
One of the things also struggled with in sort of the Native art world context, when you want to show objects from communities, beautiful things, perhaps, is often there, we don't know who the maker's name is. So what do you say about unknown maker, anonymous maker? I mean, and I don't think there's a good solution yet to that. And I think it's the same question with the photographs. I don't think there's a good language yet. So one of you will come up with that, of how to list those in some way. Names coming, whatever that might be. You have a lot of Amazon boxes there, by the way, Stormy.
Oh, I'm borrowing a coworker's office, and I think she just ordered.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Any other comments?
Hi, this is Laura. I work with Stormy. Her and I work for the Port Gamble-Squam tribe. But in regards to museums that we know have materials that could come home or could even be loaned long-term, we've been able to work with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. There was a person by the name of Chip Caldwell who come out, and they did some interviewing with our elders because he was writing a chapter in a book. But during that time, he was saying, hey, by the way, let me send you a list of materials that I think you might be interested in. So we were able to look at that, and there were some really cool pieces in there that would be amazing to have as in part of a collection to tell our story. And I think they would be willing to loan them to us. Another one is the University of Washington, the Burke Museum.
Absolutely, yes.
Collection. We have a lot of material there, and they're pretty open. I think they would be willing to long-term loan to us. And the other one that I haven't even thought about but we have our neighbor tribe, the Suquamish, they have a museum. And in the collection is a lot of material because we have a lot of intermarriage between the tribes, and there's a lot of family collections, including photographs. So even a tribal museum archive or collection might be something for us to explore and learn about how to share or request a loan from our neighbors. So that would be something different.
I think those are really good. I think Katie at the Burke is a great resource. And I think that there's probably other things around you, like Tacoma Art Museum has collections. Also in the West, we tend to have county historical societies. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right about Denver Science and Natural History with Chip. And Chip has left that position, but Steve Nash is also wonderful. So I don't think you've lost that opportunity by Chip departing from the staff at this point.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Sure, thank you for sharing. Really appreciate it. Anyone else? Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your staying with me all this time. And I apologize we're not all in a room together talking, which would be a lot more fun than doing it this way. But I really urge you to find out where those collections are and begin to talk with people, particularly this time of COVID. I think there's a good opportunity to email with people and chat with people about things. I think people are thinking about having a more beneficial life in terms of thinking about others. I think there are many, if there are going to be some good outcomes of this and the other Black Lives Matter things going on at this point, I think there's a rethinking about who we are as human beings. And I think it's an opportunity that Native people have been treated extremely poorly, and they are continued to be treated very poorly. So it's a good opportunity to be assertive about that and to make new friends. I think it's really important, and to begin to get some handle on those archives, photos and objects, and to look through the connections. I think the publications are one way, but I think looking for those papers, as we heard about, for Alaskan communities is really important, because I think it shows a different tone sometimes a surprisingly humanistic tone as compared to what's written about. Because when you write for anthropology, again, you're writing for other anthropologists. It's a shame of the discipline. I'm not easy on the discipline. I am an anthropologist. I'm a PhD anthropologist, but I'm not easy on the discipline. And the first thing I tell the students who come to Poeh as part of our ancestral sites investigations is that although they were born way after all these things happened, as anthropologists, even aspiring anthropologists, they are responsible for creating the change.
Very good.
Melissa or Susan, any last words?
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Sure.
And I appreciate all the members of the cohort who let us know what, resources they have found. I think that gets us all thinking about other places that we can look at for, our objects. And does anybody have any other questions? No? Okay. Well, then I
All right.
will
Thanks.
see you next week. All right. Have a great week.
All right.
Bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.